afternoon. My name is Doug Cluck. I am here in Kansas City. I work for NOAA. I'm the Regional Climate Services Director here, and we are about ready to begin the August monthly North Central U.S. Climate and Drought briefing. Today, Brian Fuchs from the National Drought Mitigation Center, as you can see there hopefully on your screen, we'll be going through a set of slides talking about issues across the north central part of the U.S. There is an elephant in the room, and it's called drought, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And at the end, or actually during the broadcast, feel free, if questions come up in your mind, to write them down in the question zone. There's a little question area in the webinar, or your thoughts in general. We'll try to relay those as best we can at the end. Some of your questions we may be able to answer on the fly. Some we just wait till the end. But please feel free to come up with a list of questions, because we'll have time at the end of the webinar to deal with those. This webinar is being recorded for your information. So, Brian, why don't you take it away, and thank you very much.
All right. Hey, thank you for joining today, everyone, and thank you, Doug, for the good introduction. And like he said, if there's a question that we can answer during the presentation, make note of that in the chat. If not, I'll let Doug moderate the questions at the end, and I'll go through my slides here fairly quickly and hopefully leave some time for questions. Like every month, there's a lot of people that come together to bring these webinars to you. I'm coming at you today from the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And as you can see on my title slide here, there's a lot of cooperators from the regional climate centers through American Association of State Climatologists, NOAA, the USDA Climate Hubs, etc., that are all working to bring this out to you regularly. So with that, I will dig in with there it is. Okay. General information today, again, talking about the collaborators and cooperators to put this together. The next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, September 21st at the same time. And Dennis Toddy from the USDA Midwest Climate Hub will be leading that webinar for us. Access to future webinars can be gained by going through that link and registering, and you can find the past webinars on both the Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers web pages at the two links provided below as well. So the agenda today, what I'm going to do is talk about some of the current and recent past conditions, some of the regional impacts that have been being felt in the region, general ones, some based on agriculture, and then updates on what's going on up in the northern plains and as far as drought goes in the rest of the region. We'll look at the outlooks that just got updated today, as well as taking any questions at the end. So current conditions, and a lot of times pictures can say a lot. This is some pictures of agricultural hail damage that were sent to me from Becky Bollinger out in Colorado. And you can really see the damage that's been being done by some of the more recent severe weather that we've had in the region, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So over the last 30 days, we can see that temperatures have been fairly cool through the region. So this is going from the 18th of July through yesterday. And for most locations, we're seeing a solid 2 degrees below normal during that period, and there are pockets of cooler 3 to 4 degrees below normal readings throughout the region. There are some, you see some yellows out there on that map, and we are seeing that those are near normal to maybe slightly above during that time frame. But as a whole, the region has been cooler than normal since about the middle of July. And looking at precipitation during that time, I have the departure of normal on the left-hand side and percent of normal on the right. And just drawing your eyes to the percent of normal here over the last 30 days, all those purples, even the greens that are out there on the map, and even the yellows, those are right at normal to all above normal. So you do see quite a few areas that stand out through the Dakotas into Nebraska, a lot of Colorado, into portions of Missouri and Kansas, central Minnesota. But then you also see the opposite. The red up in Montana really stands out, as well as what we're seeing in southern Iowa and northern Missouri, as well as in the northern parts of Minnesota and for most of the lower peninsula of Michigan. So it kind of depends on where you are, and the weather pattern has kind of dictated that if you're in an area that has picked up some of these thunderstorms, you have seen quite a bit of rain, and if you've been missed, you've really been missed. Looking at some of those departures, you know, up in Montana this time of year, that departure from normal is only about 1.5 inches below normal. But when you get into northern Missouri, southern Iowa, some of those departures for the last 30 days are reaching, you know, 3 to 4.5 inches below normal during that time. So how did July stack up with the rest of the Julys on record? And at NCEI, we can do a comparison of the state rankings for July with temperature on the left and precipitation on the right. With 120 years of record now, we can see that there was a clear delineation over the western U.S. where a lot of those areas were much above average during that time frame. The high plains, they were above average for the most part for July. And then as you get into the Midwest, most of the conditions were near average. We can see on the precipitation side, definitely out in the eastern Corn Belt through Ohio, Indiana, much above average during that time frame. And then out west, you can see where Colorado came in, top 5. Is that top 5? No, top 10 dry, or excuse me, wettest July on record for them. And a lot of that precipitation has been really on the eastern side of the state as well. Then you go up to the northern plains and see that not only was it top 5 warmest July on record for Montana, but also top 5 driest on record as far as state rankings go. And over in North Dakota, we saw some similar dryness as well. So kind of a tale of two different sides of the region. The eastern side has been wet, fairly cool to near average temperatures in July. And then you go to the north and west part of the region, and we see warmth and dryness. And so how are we seeing these conditions on some of the indicators that we look at? And QuickDRI was something that's been being developed here at our shop and with several partners as they're listed, but it's really looking at this rapid development cycle that can show up quite quickly this time of year. And you really can see some of those wetter areas here in the Midwest and parts of the northern plains, especially if you're east of the Missouri River Valley. But then you see Montana, western South Dakota, even in parts of the Sandhills of Nebraska standing out as an area that's been drier over the last couple weeks. But then also looking at southern Iowa, northern Missouri, and parts of central Kansas. Some of these areas are really getting picked up well on tools such as QuickDRI, and I'll also throw up here the ESI, the Evaporative Stress Index, that you can see that through these areas not only has that warmth been evident, but also seeing what it's done to the water balance in the region with the successive ET compared to the potential during that time. Again, we can go back a little bit further instead of just looking at the last month, but we can kind of look at what we've seen through much of the summer as a whole. And again, departure from normal precipitation on the left and percent of normal. And really looking at the percent of normal up there in the northern plains, we can see why drought has been an issue up there. A lot of those areas are only 25 to 50% of normal precipitation, with even pockets that are drier during the last 90 days. And those are equating to departures of about 6 inches below normal through a lot of eastern Montana and into portions of North and South Dakota. And then the other area that really stands out, again, is this area in southern Iowa, going up into central and northwest Iowa, and also catching parts of northern Missouri. We're seeing that during this time frame, the last 90 days, anywhere from 6 to 8 inches below normal precipitation, with some pockets again of drier conditions in there. and that relates to about 25 again to 50% of normal during that time frame. And the other area I want to pick out is the wet side. And if you look at western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and even into parts of central Nebraska, some of that abundant rain, again, consistently over this 90-day period has really jumped up some of those departures where they're seeing 2 to 4 inches above normal. And then the further east you go, where we get into Indiana and Ohio, where it's been cool and wet throughout the entire growing season, we see that, again, 100 to 150% of normal, quite common, with departures above normal of anywhere 4 to 6 inches, and even pockets of wetter conditions during that time. So I guess what I'm trying to say with these data is we are seeing a mix of conditions depending on where you're at, and there really is a transient zone between the northwest to the southeast portions of the region. And to throw things up for the year to date, again, we see those wet conditions in Kansas and Colorado, portions of Nebraska, and then through a lot of the upper Midwest and the eastern portions. But then you can really see that dry slot that starts up in Montana and goes all the way down into Iowa, that really is showing that this area has consistently missed out on precipitation throughout the entire year. And when we start looking at, for just the calendar year of 2017, some of these departures are in that 9 to 12 inch range depending on where you're at, and percent of normal, especially in the drier locations up in eastern Montana and western North and South Dakota. Seeing 25% of normal precipitation for the calendar year is quite significant, and when we talk about the drought conditions a little bit later, it will match up quite well to where we're seeing some of these impacts. So the May through July climate, so looking at this time frame, quite similar to what we saw just in July. Again, the warmth over the west, quite normal as far as temperatures go through much of the Midwest and portions of the plains. And then for precipitation, again, that dryness, that May through July, and both North Dakota and Montana, top 5 dry events, where we see that wetness again over Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, even into parts of Michigan, West Virginia, and Colorado stands out as well. That those pockets that have been wet have been very wet, and those that have been dry have been very dry. And this really shows that it hasn't been just a short-term type of event at this point. So some of the regional impacts that we've seen due to this these types of conditions, again, more recently we've seen quite a bit of severe weather in the region, and that's really has done some damage to some of the agricultural production. And these were shared by some folks up in South Dakota. Looking at the photo on the left, you would think it was winter, the way that hail is piled up, and then just to see how the corn crop was decimated. And that has been one of the things that we have noted, that with severe weather that's been popping up here in the last month, what we're seeing is those areas that are getting impacted by these heavy rain events, but also are getting this hail, and what it can do in a short term to some of the agricultural production in those regions. It's quite amazing to just see how quickly a crop can go from being green and flourishing to be gone. So that's really something that we're pointing out. Some baseball-sized hail in central Nebraska here recently, as well as some widespread flash flooding and high winds as these storms have went through. Again, I've seen photos and been hearing reports of entire fields being washed out that had pretty good stands of corn going in them, and the heavy rains have just really took care of them in a hurry. We've had some flash flooding and high winds in Greeley, Colorado, also, again, central Nebraska and here recently, and then up to 2 feet of hail in Evan, Colorado in 10 to 15 minutes on August 9th. Again, just thinking of, typical summertime events, but then to see the excessiveness of not only the rain, but some of this hail really catches your attention in a hurry, and then what those impacts are, again, especially in that agricultural section or sector. So looking at the Missouri River, We can see that in 2017 on the right-hand side of the storage chart, we're right in the mid-range of where we should be. We're not up where we were in 2011, and we're not seeing some of those minimum flows either. So we're right where we would expect the river should be right now, with about 61 million acre-feet in storage. So really not too much, other than saying that the headwaters to the Missouri River have really been impacted the most by the drought, and really impacting how much water is available and being stored on some of the reservoirs, which is being shown in that the lower left-hand portion of the screen. And as we talk about stream flows, we can see that the 28-day stream flow averages, you're seeing a lot of greens and blues on the map, especially in the Midwest. As you get into the plains, Iowa and northern Missouri again stand out with seeing much below normal stream flows. And then through the northern plains and even the central plains, it's more spotty. And Colorado stands out as well, that a lot of the riverways are well above normal for where they typically are for this time of year. Looking at the Missouri River Basin as a whole, we can see that some of those dry readings up in Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and then again on the lower reaches as we get into portions of Iowa and Missouri. And then looking at the upper Mississippi, again, just another view, catching what we're seeing in that dryness in Iowa and to parts of Illinois as far as stream flows go. And then we see the opposite. And when we go into the Ohio River Valley, almost everything there is normal to well above normal for this time of year, with only a few spotty gauges showing up. And again, some of those could be based on seasonal management decisions as well. And so we go to the Great Lakes, and we can see that for each of the circled area that I have highlighted, again, this has not taken into account a lot of the recent rains that have fallen through some of these regions. As the last, I updated the slide this morning, and August 12th is the most recent NLDAS soil moisture product that's out there. But what we're seeing is there are some anomalies in soil moisture, and then you can also see through portions of western Kansas, eastern Colorado, there's some excessive soil moisture readings for this time of year as well. So some of the dry areas that we are experiencing are being picked up quite well by NLDAS, and again, we really want to watch this. Probably want to go to the link in the next day or so and just see what the update will look like with the impact of some of the recent rains, not only through the Midwest, but in also parts of the plains. I'll advance to the next slide. Okay, and so how has this been impacting the overall maturity and advancement of crops in the region? And this is straight out of the USDA Crop and Weather Bulletin for this week, looking at the growing degree day anomalies based on the April 1st start date and using the 8650 methodology. And what we're seeing is through a lot of the eastern Corn Belt, even with some of the cooler temperatures and even with some of the later planting dates that were experienced, going back to April 1st, growing degree days have been accumulating fine. And then we get into portions of Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, eastern Nebraska, and the eastern Dakotas down into Kansas. A lot of those areas are showing right at where they should be, and then in Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin, you're seeing some areas that are quite a bit behind on where they should be for growing degree days. And again, really dictated by where we have not seen much of that heat through this summer in that pocket of normal to below normal growing degree days. So it will be something to keep an eye on as we go through the rest of August, and we'll show it a little bit in the outlooks at the end of the presentation of just what this is going to mean as we go forward with both corn and soybeans maturing, or getting to the maturing stage as we're about halfway through August now. So we are seeing those deficits accumulating. So we get into the drought update, and like Doug said earlier, The elephant in the room is really what's been going on in the Dakotas and in eastern Montana, and more recently we've seen some of that dryness expand through much of Montana. And when we start seeing extreme and exceptional drought in these regions, they are quite intense situations with quite a few impacts. Mainly, initially, we're seeing that in the agricultural section, especially the livestock producers are being impacted by lack of forage and stock water availability. But we're also starting to get some precipitation back into these areas. And one of the questions that comes up is, even after these rains return and the impacts are still there, when do you start showing improvements in these regions? Because those impacts just aren't going to go away. And that's a question to really consider and look at. And for some of those producers, they're going to be really thinking about, well, what's going to be the situation going into next season. But we do have quite a bit of drought in the northern plains and in portions of Iowa and Nebraska. And there has been areas of northern Missouri that we've been watching closely to see if it warrants any drought expansion or introduction into those regions here in the short term. So how do we look at as a nation? Looking at the stats, we're only about 9.5% of the country is in drought right now, compared to last year where we were at about 16.5%. So year to year, we're seeing less drought, but what we are seeing is quite a bit of intense drought. Right now, just a little over 18 million people are being impacted by drought with the new release today, but that makes sense to me as some of these areas that are being impacted are not catching any of the metropolitan areas that some of the other droughts that we've seen develop in the last year have. So that number may seem low to some, but for those that are being impacted, it is quite a severe situation. Looking at the North Central region as a whole, we are seeing about a quarter of the region being impacted by drought. And realistically, we're not seeing any drought on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. So most all of that is confined to the western portion of the region, and even more so in the north central portion of the North Central region. So we are seeing that about just under 2% of this area is in exceptional drought right now. Comparing the drought conditions right now compared to where they were a year ago, we're at, like I said, a little over 25% right now in drought, and a year ago we were just over 9.5%. Looking at the Missouri River watershed, not much difference, just showing that most of that drought region is confined to that watershed. So going into the outlooks here, over the next 7-day period, which covers the 17th through the 24th of August, we do see that that wetter pattern that has developed here more recently is going to stay quite active over most of the Midwest and Central Plains. Some of these areas over Iowa with 2-inch amounts, over Michigan with 2-inch amounts. That's something that we'll wait and see how it turns out. But again, most areas are showing right at an inch to above an inch of precipitation over the next 7 days. And as we go a little bit further out in the next 8 to 14 days, we can see that the temperatures are on the left and precipitation is on the right, and this covers the period pretty much taking us through the end of August, where the west is continuing to show higher than normal probabilities of above normal temperatures, and that is reaching into parts of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and the Dakotas and Nebraska. And then we see the flip side of it. Some of those areas that have been cool through much of August, there's a pretty good probability that they're going to stay cool through the end of the month. So August is going to be one of those months that when the statistics come out, we'll have to see how it ranks on that cooler than normal side for a lot of the Midwest and especially the eastern portions of the region. When we start looking at precipitation over the next 8 to 14 days, quite different than what we were seeing for the next 7 days. So it looks like that towards the end of the month, below normal probabilities of normal precipitation enhanced probabilities of below normal precipitation through the Great Lakes region and through much of the Midwest. At the same time, we're seeing some higher probabilities of above normal precipitation reaching up from the far southern plains and into Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado during this time. And looking at the monthly outlook for September, we have, again, temperatures on the left and precipitation on the right. Most of the region is in that EC region, so equal chances, but we do see an area of below normal, higher than normal chances of below normal temperatures in the Central Plains and portions of Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and down into Oklahoma. During that same time, precipitation, again, the probabilities of seeing wetter than normal conditions are higher over the eastern portion of the region, and then EC are equal chances of either above or below through most of the rest of the region in the month of September. As we look at the entire fall season, September through November, again, we see those temperatures, which has been a fairly common outlook, showing the higher than normal probabilities of above normal temperatures through the region, especially through the northern reaches of the Midwest and Plains, and pretty much equal chances for precipitation throughout the entire region as we go through the fall season. And again, preliminary, we're going to look at the winter here, looking at December through February. Temperatures, we do see a dip in temperature probabilities to EC through a lot of the region, which is different than what we have for the fall season right now. But we do see from Montana through Nebraska, and then again going through the eastern portions of the Midwest, an enhanced probability.
And Brian, EC means equal chances of above, below, or near normal.
Or near normal. Thank you for the correction. And when we see the precipitation outlook for the winter right now, we're seeing in the Intermountainous West above enhancement of better chances of above normal precipitation, but then through much of our region we are seeing the EC, which again is equal chances of above, below, or normal during that time frame. And the seasonal drought outlook is showing that a lot of that drought that we're seeing through the Dakotas and Montana is going to persist, and this is taking us through the end of November, and also with the opportunity of some development likely through portions of Idaho and more of Montana and into the portions of the Great Basin up there. But on the flip side, we are seeing some drought removal likely and or improvement through eastern South Dakota into Iowa and Kansas, Nebraska, and again, a lot of that has been dictated by what we're seeing here in the near term of this active precipitation pattern and what it means to the drought in the regions here. So quickly just highlighting some of our partners that we work with, and I will take any questions as I throw up my contact information. And I'll let Doug moderate those questions. Thank you, everyone, especially working through the technical difficulties today. Glad you could stick around.
And thank you, Brian, for letting us throw you off your game. That's fun to do to you. Can we back up? Can we back up to the QPF slide real quick? I just want to do some clarifications and go through this a little bit. So this is an accumulation of precipitation over a week, from now until next week, basically. So understand that that this isn't going to all happen at once necessarily. It may not. This is the best indication of what we have in terms of precipitation over that period. So it may fall, in various ways. I'd also say that drought-stricken areas for the next week don't look like they're going to get a heck of a lot more relief from a precipitation point of view. All right. So go to the next slide, Brian. Yeah, and then here, the 8 to 14-day outlook, as Brian indicated, the chances for above normal temperatures are enhanced, again, mainly across the drought-stricken area in the northern plains and the whole west, for that matter. And then cooler the normal conditions are a lot more likely across the Midwest and lower Midwest, if you will. And then if you look at precipitation, it's you see that sort of above normal greenness coming up through the plains, but dryness really. Great Lakes and then in the Pacific Northwest. So there's not any sort of major, if you will, drought busting thing coming up in the next couple weeks. Next slide, because I think there's a couple more things to mention as we go through this. Not really much to say about that. They don't have a good indication on precipitation in September, one way or the other. It says equal chances, which means basically means there's not a lot of evidence to say it's going to be wet, dry, or anything. There's just not a lot of evidence. I will point out, though, that the enhanced above normal temperatures across the Northwest certainly spreads into the northern plains as well, and that's not necessarily a good thing when conditions are already dry. Next slide. The autumn. Yeah. So, you know, Brian covered this fine. Better chances for above normal temperatures. That's been the trend over the last many years as well. So that's where they're getting there. And then I think the drought. Go two more. I don't want to talk about the winter. And okay, there. Yeah, this. I just want to let you all know this is relatively unusual from a seasonal drought outlook. Sometimes on a monthly basis they'll do this, but on a seasonal outlook, it's fairly rare that they'll put a lot of that yellow area in there, and that's quite a bit of area where they're claiming drought development is likely. And if you look back at some of those outlooks that Brian just showed for autumn, you can in the month of September, you can kind of see why they may be saying that. Above normal temperatures and really no indication on precipitation. So they're sort of looking at a increased area of a drought potential, certainly for Idaho, but really for Montana. And I don't mean to be a bad news dude, but that's sort of what I want to give you a better indication of or clarify a little bit for that. Now, and when we turn to the questions, I have to admit Bryce had some questions up there, and Benjamin Diamond. Let me see if Bryce is still on the call. He's not, but you know what? We have the perfect person to answer one of the questions if I remember it correctly. He asked about early frost worries and conditions for agriculture in, I think, the upper Midwest and probably North Dakota. So North Dakota, you know, east of there. So I think, Brian, if you don't mind, I'll call on Dennis to sort of, because I think he had a few words to say a little earlier to us about crops progressing a little slowly because of cooler temperatures. Do you want to say something about that, Dennis?
Sure. That topic has started percolating around the ag areas, around the corn areas particularly, especially that area that Brian noted had the below average degree day accumulation since April 1. Right now, there is a note that those northern areas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, possibly parts of Iowa, possibly parts of northern Illinois, that are the cool temperatures since mid-July have put corn behind on its heat accumulation, its degree day accumulation. So it doesn't look like a huge issue just yet, but if you run through, we've got a growing degree day tool that the regional climate centers now run. Those are indicating that black layer may not be coming until close to freeze dates, and that is all pending what happens in the way of temperatures from here on out. The warmer than average temperatures that are noted are a good sign for this. I think at the end of the day, it probably won't be an issue, but it's something we're going to have to keep watching very closely.
Yep. Thanks, Dennis. And just say black layer is?
It's physiological maturity for corn.
Okay. Once it hits that, we're happy, right?
Correct.
All right. We have another question from Benjamin Diamond. And you know, Ben, you're still there. I'm going to open up your phone line, Ben, so you can ask this in person. And anybody else that has a question, Merlin, I see your hand is raised. If you do have a question, let me know there. Ben, I just took you off, so you can ask your question now, or you can go live.
I had a question about the USDA crop condition reports that I don't see a big impact on the rating for corn and soybean from the recent dryness. And my other question was, will the recent precipitation help the corn condition, or is it too late, or soybean as well?
Yeah, and I think, no, Benjamin, are you talking about the areas in the northern plains specifically, or are you talking about Iowa?
Just in general.
Okay.
In Iowa. In the western,
yeah.
There's probably two different answers. So why don't we talk about the northern plains first in terms of corn and soybeans?
Right. Much of the northern plains area is outside the big corn growing areas. It's right on the edge of it. So if you look at state by state, look at the Dakotas or Dakotas, parts of Minnesota and parts of Iowa, the corn condition rating does show up as not very good overall. But there's a large part of the corn belt that has not been impacted by drought. So the overall, if you look at the sum total crop condition of corn, it's not so bad. And the your second question is, yes, the damage has been done by this point. So additional dryness really is not going to make it too much worse.
Well, would additional wetness be of any assistance at this point to any of those places?
Additional wetness could have a little bit of help, but not very much. Most of now you're filling out kernels, so a little bit of moisture could help fill out kernels that are there, but the damage has largely been done to the corn crop already.
And is that also true in Iowa?
Yes, that is also true in Iowa.
Okay, and then soybeans.
Soybeans, there is still help. The rainfall will help soybeans at this point. And people would, a couple reports I've heard from other conversations are, there are some soybeans that really could use some rainfall right now, because soybeans still have the ability to fill out their pods, so additional rainfall would help fill out pods throughout August. So now that we're in the middle part of August, some additional rainfall.
Okay. Yeah, and just a comment from Virgil Schmidt. They like slow growing degree accumulation at this time of the year for corn, as it enhances grain fill and lowers water needs as long as maturity beats the killing frost, which is a good point. So, in other words, the cool temperatures are helpful, especially in places that are very dry, because the demand isn't so great. And then, as Virgil just reflects what you said, Dennis, in terms of moisture will help soybeans here on out. I'm going to finish up with you, Benjamin. You just asked how widespread was the hail damage. I don't know if we have do we know how widespread it was? I don't know if it's...
Well, there's been multiple events as well, and yeah. It's really hard to tell. Some counties were hit really hard, other counties right next door missed. So it's kind of one of those anecdotal type of comments, but it has been happening quite a bit recently in many locations: Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, into Missouri.
So yeah, definitely eastern Colorado's taken I'd say the brunt of that from what we've recently heard. But I'm sure other places, because they just had day after day of sort of severe weather. I have a comment from Megan, and Megan, are you on? Yeah, I do want to hear what you have to say. Megan is is with the Weather Service, but she is out of South Dakota. I'm getting some background noise from you, Megan, but go ahead. Can you hear me, Megan? You might have muted yourself. Oh, you muted yourself. Oh, are you back? All right, well, I'll ask her question, or her comment, I'll at least say. They've experienced, and she's from Aberdeen area, so South Dakota, the worst of the impacts from drought. This time of the year, dry conditions are more normal, she says, though not usually this dry. Stream flows are at their lowest, but are seeing she has in quotes, hoot owl restrictions on various river. How do we emphasize the drought that we are experiencing with fewer impacts this time of year? It's a great question. And what should we be concerned about with forecasts of continued dry and warm expected? And are there hydro concerns? And anybody want to speak to that?
Well, with the hydrological concerns, most definitely the drought situation that we've seen has been short-term drought. It's been typically in a time scale of 6 months or less, and so there have not been a lot of hydrological issues, at least on the larger water delivery systems. Now, there may be smaller streams and stock ponds and that are being impacted, but typically those do take a lot longer to start rearing their head, so to speak, when you are in a drought. If we continue to see these dry conditions as we go forward, the seasonal dryness, a lot of the agricultural folks aren't going to complain about, because what's done is done, and they want to harvest. But we do, here we are in August, where we will start talking about soil moisture recharge going into the fall and winter, and that will really start setting the stage of where this drought will go if it does stick around long term.
The other thing I'll add to this is, Megan, is there are likely to be some ecosystem issues in terms of potentially water being too warm for certain species. There are disease vectors when various creatures have to get together at certain watering holes, that kind of thing, and they spread the disease. I have heard mosquito and other issues as well continuing to be an issue in terms of well, not only bothersome but also carrying diseases as well. Somebody else say something along those lines? Okay. I have not heard. I think there were some water restrictions earlier in this drought, maybe at Fort Belknap. The Fort Belknap reservation, some issues up there. Rocky Boy, maybe it was Rocky Boy actually that we heard that. Thank you. And nothing lately. So again, Virgil said there was a 2.5-mile wide strip of hail from Lost Nation, Iowa to Walnut, Illinois, that apparently took out crops in that area. Any other comments or questions anybody has there? I apologize profusely for what happened to the webinar. I don't know if the recording is going to be a little messed up or not. We'll find out. But tune in next month. Dennis Toddy, not yours truly, but my brother from another mother, I guess you'd say. We'll be doing.
I'm waving right now into the camera.
We'll be doing the briefing next in September. So, and I think in October, just as a preview, I think we're going to get a guy named by the name of Brad Rippey to follow Laura Edwards to do a sort of wrap up on the season in terms of how climate has impacted crops and such like that. But more on that later. But thank you for sticking in there. And if you have any questions beyond this or need any specific help for your state or your group or whatever, don't hesitate to email me or call me or whatever, or Brian, or Dennis for that matter. We'll get you to the right person if we're not the right person. So thank you very much, and we will talk to you next month. Bye-bye.